Alright, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here in the unit on Age of Exploration Isolation. So today we're going to talk about something a little different. We're going to talk about isolation and trade today. So our objectives and standards are to analyze trade in India by different European countries and to describe European contacts with China, Japan, and Korea. And take a moment there to read the standards if you would please. And our desired result, remember to include this in your weekly summary if you would. How did different Asian groups interact with Europeans? So think about how different Asian groups are going to interact with Europeans in terms of trade and other areas, and that'll help you answer your desired result question. So trade in India. Merchants from Europe were fascinated by India's luxury goods and the Mughal court. And they were also, was also the center of the spice trade. India was also known for its silk and cotton cloth in the textile industry, which was also very popular. And Europeans and Indians are going to agree to trading rights. Now, Portugal and later the Dutch, English, and French built forts and warehouses in India in coastal towns. But there's going to be problems in India. The Mughal Empire had declined over time, and civil war had broken out between the Hindus in India and the Muslims in India. We also have some peasant rebellions that occurred as rulers increased taxes. And in the early 1700s, India is going to face weak rulers, corruption, and a central government that's going to begin to fade. So the decline of the Mughal Empire, or the decline of Mughal power, also saw conflict between the French and English in India. We have sepoys, or Indian troops, which were used by trading companies of both nations as kind of soldiers who kind of fought each other and things like that. And fighting between France and England will eventually spread around the world as well. And we'll get to that when we talk about the colonies in a little bit here in a couple of weeks about the French and Indian War and things like that in North America. But eventually, the English will be successful at pushing the French out of India. So Chinese trade with Europe. Ships from Portugal reached China in 1514. Now, foreigners, including the Portuguese, were considered as barbarians by the Chinese because they lacked what the Chinese considered civilized Chinese ways. However, Europeans wrote exciting and positive views of the Chinese. So while the Chinese had different views of the Europeans had a pretty good positive view of the Chinese. Now, in China, the Ming Empire, or the Ming Dynasty, was in control, and they had very little interest in trade with Europeans. For trade to take place, Chinese demanded payment in gold or silver, and eventually the Chinese will allow European nations to trade. Now, missionaries in China. When traders arrived in China, Portuguese missionaries arrived with them. I remember Portuguese are religious people who are looking to spread Christianity in some cases, help out other areas that might not be as civilized. So later, Jesuits from Spain, Italy, and Portugal arrived. Now, they had a broad knowledge of many subjects, and the Chinese did welcome them. One of these was Matteo Ricci, who you see here, a brilliant Jesuit priest who learned to speak Chinese and adopted Chinese clothing. Ricci wanted to convert upper-class Chinese to Christianity in hopes of spreading it to other parts of China. Now, he also gained friends in Chinese scholars who were interested in European ideas and arts, but despite attempts by missionaries, they had little success in converting Chinese to Christianity. In terms of changes, the Ming Dynasty began to decline by the early 1600s, and invaders from a region in northeast China, the Manchus, invaded and captured Beijing, the capital of China, in 1644. After that, a new dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, was set up, and they won the support of scholars. Chinese power grew under Kangxi, up top here, and also his grandson Qing Long on the bottom picture there. Both did expand power and territory for China, and farming was also boosted with the arrival of crops from the Americas such as potatoes and corn. So limits on trade. Restriction on foreign traders was continued by the Qing dynasty. However, Europeans continued to press to expand trade in China. In 1793, Lord Macartney arrived in China on a British diplomatic mission and brought goods with him. Now, there was misunderstandings which continued frustration between both groups. Lord Macartney was told he would need to perform the traditional kowtow, which means touching his head to the ground to show respect to the emperor. Now, when Macartney refused to do this, negotiations failed. Policies by China in terms of trade did more harm than good in the long run. They're going to miss out on a lot of different things, especially weapons and things like that. And this picture here is a picture of Lord Macartney presenting his goods to the Chinese emperor. An invasion of Korea. Traders from Korea had far-reaching contacts across East Asia before the 1500s. Excuse me. Now, Japan invaded Korea in 1592 and again in 1597. Now, they were pushed out in 1598, but villages were burned and disease and famine impacted Korea. In 1636, the Manchus, remember from China, invaded Korea before they could recover, and under the Qing dynasty, Korea was a country run by itself, but forced to kind of acknowledge the supremacy of China. Following the invasions, Korea adopted isolation in terms of foreign policy, except for a few Japanese and the Chinese, and European sailors that were shipwrecked on Korean shores were actually imprisoned. However, even though Korea was kind of isolating itself from the rest of the world, they continued to explore and build their own arts and knowledge. Now, Japan welcomes foreigners. In 1543, Portugal reaches Japan, followed by Spain, the Dutch, and the English. Sorry, I should say the Dutch there. See if I can fix that real quick. I do apologize. Put the there. The Dutch. I'm talking about the Netherlands and things like that, right? So early on, Japan did welcome foreigners, but they arrived at a time when Japanese daimyos, or powerful warrior lords, were struggling for power. Now, Western firearms will be quickly adopted, which may have helped the Tokugawa shoguns impose order and seize power. Now, the Japanese were also more welcoming to Christian missionaries, such as Spanish priest Francis Xavier. You see him here. Many Japanese were interested in learning about Christianity and did convert to Christianity. Others were intrigued by new inventions, such as, like we've talked about, the printing press. So increasing hostility towards foreigners occurred by Tokugawa shoguns. When Spain seized control of the Philippines, some Japanese saw foreigners as a threat and were afraid that they could do the same to Japan. Others were concerned that Japanese Christians would give their allegiance to the Pope instead of Japanese leaders, and Tokugawa shoguns expelled foreign missionaries and persecuted Japanese Christians, killing thousands of people. European traders and merchants were forbidden by 1638. Japan also banned the building of large ships to isolate themselves even further, although one or two Dutch ships were permitted per year to keep the trade and keep, I should say, the Japanese informed, right? So let's see if I can fix that here. My apologies again. Must have gotten cut off. The Japanese informed. Just trying to fix that here for you. So again, they were looking to be isolated, but they were also looking to stay informed about what was going on in the world around them. Again, they just didn't want a lot of people interacting or trying to change their way of lives. And there's actually a movie out there which I think talks about some of this missionary persecution and Christian mercenary persecution. I forget the name of the movie. I believe it was rated R, so be careful with that. But it was a pretty interesting movie. I'll see if I can try and find it and remember it later. So isolation in Japan. For more than 200 years, Japan remained isolated. However, trade does grow inside the country, along with arts and literature, and some merchant families gained wealth and status. Now, Edo, which is present-day Tokyo, the capital of Japan, had 1 million inhabitants by the early 1700s, more than London. All right, so our closure. How did different Asian groups interact with Europeans? Think about the Chinese, the Japanese, those in India, the Koreans. Again, they're all kind of different. They're all kind of over the place with trade, about being isolated, not isolated, and then maybe being open to trade and then isolated again, or whatever the case may be. So think about that, and that'll help you answer your question. Be sure to include it in the weekly summary, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or night.